Hello, strangers. Don't adjust that dial. You've tuned in to Neon Static, where once a week, a true, scary story you won't hear anywhere else is told to you by me, your host, Vi, and my staff of caffeinated beverages. And dating. Whew, it's rough out there. And everyone seems to have a story, an experience of their very worst date. And today's story is one of those. It's story number 7, and it goes like this. At the time of this story, my roommate and I were in college, and we were celebrating that fact down at the bars downtown. While we paused outside a bar to have a smoke, filthy habit I've since quit, I noticed a good-looking guy watching our group. I was a little buzzed, so I waved at him and smiled, inviting him over. In this way, I sort of welcomed what was going to happen. This is a fact that my friends and roommate have yet to let me live down. The guy walked over, bummed a light, and gave his name as Tim. Tim had dark, thick hair, a smirky, crooked smile, and was a little taller than me even as I teetered around in my heels. When he asked for my phone number, wanting to take me out and show me a good time, I gave it to him readily. He smiled, thanked my friend for the light, and disappeared into the night. Over the next few days, we texted and finally settled upon a time for us to meet up for our date. The night of the date, he insisted on coming to pick me up. He'd been kind of secretive on the phone, but assured me it would be a good time. And what I came to find out was that our first date was a small party, and it was also about 40 minutes away from my house. I was thrown off by his insistence that he drive. Easygoing or not, it's a big no-no on a first date to not have a means to safely exit a situation, and the distance of the drive gave me pause. As we got further and further from the safety of the area of town I knew and into rural suburbs on the outskirts of the town's clustered spread. Still, I didn't want to make a big deal out of it or overreact if the guy was just trying to save me gas money. I went along, knowing that if I had to make good my escape, well, Ubering was going to be expensive. When we arrived at the small, intimate party, though, the worst of my fears, that this was in fact some ambush that would end with me found in a ditch, well, it wasn't realized, but every other fear I had was. The party was easily 100 people. Small and intimate, I was surrounded by strangers. Worse yet, it was a birthday party. The birthday girl was polite, but obviously not ecstatic that the party had a surprise +1. Tim laughed at her comments and assured her I was cool. Why, she might be looking at her new best friend thanks to him. But I didn't feel great about it, and she looked like she didn't either. Tim promptly brought me out back, behind her house. They had a bonfire and a smoking pit going back there. He told me I'll go get us some drinks, and then he disappeared. I mean, he vanished. He was gone for the better part of an hour. I took a few laps around the backyard trying to find him. I felt more and more like an interloper as I searched through clusters of people looking for the one I actually knew. I took one lap back through the house too, encountering the birthday girl talking to a few others. When they paused as I approached to lamely ask if they'd seen my date, I got the feeling she was complaining about me to them. Defeated and feeling terrible, I thanked them for their help. They told me they hadn't seen him, some help, and I returned to the smoke pit to wait, see if he came back, or think over my options. While me and my cigarettes smoldered, a guy approached and took a seat next to me. He introduced himself as Sean. Sean was funny, friendly, and upon asking how I knew the birthday girl and finding out I didn't, well, he wanted to know what had brought me to a complete stranger's birthday party. He was surprised when he learned that he was meeting a girl standing all alone on a first date. I chose not to name the first date as Tim, Even if I had a right to be annoyed, bashing a guy in front of his friends is never a good look. I think Sean felt bad for me. He stuck around and talked with me for a bit. His presence was welcome as both a distraction from my annoyance and, as it turns out, an interesting guy in his own right. After a solid 20 minutes of conversation, both of us increasingly more excited with the discovery of books, movies, and other stuff we had in common, he asked me for my phone number. Once he typed my number into his phone, he pressed call, so I'd have his too. Then he told me he had to go catch up with some other friends. He asked again if I would be all right, even offered to find me a lift back if I couldn't find my date, but I insisted he go have fun and that I'd troubled him enough. So he left, and I was there standing alone yet again. At that very moment, who should appear from the dark but Tim? He was, to put it mildly, well lubricated. I could smell the strong liquor fumes over the cigarettes and campfire smoke. And while he was smiling and acting as if all was well, there was this undercurrent of tension in him. I guessed that maybe he'd seen me speaking with Sean. Maybe he wasn't exactly stoked that I had traded numbers with another guy. But he never mentioned this. Instead, he took my hand and drew me away to the side of the house, where it was quieter, fewer people there. As he began to excitedly tell me about an after-party at one of the partygoers' houses, it became obvious that he wasn't just buzzed. He was fall-down drunk, but manic, too. His animated actions threw him off balance as he gestured. He kept stumbling into me even as we stood still. Kicked my shins once or twice, too. We were alone enough that I chanced embarrassing him with a rejection. I told him I was not into another round of whatever this was, and I wanted to go home. He seemed disappointed, but then he seemed to rebound. He tucked an arm around my shoulders and slurred, "Yeah, you're right. Let's go somewhere private." Oh God, no. After all of this, he thought I was going to hook up with him. I thought about saying something then and there, but he'd already started pulling me along, back to the party, and all of his friends. I couldn't bring myself to embarrass him by rejecting him in public. More to the point, as we ambled towards the door, I realized he still intended to drive us back to my place. As I neared the car, my high heels crunching in the gravel driveway, I casually asked for the keys. He turned to look at me, still close, arms still around me, his fetid breath in danger of giving me contact drunk. For a split second, that weird tension returned, stronger than before. His hand gripped his keys, his jaw clenched so hard it looked like it hurt. And it sounds weird, but in that moment, I thought, he wants to hit me. That thought alone shocked me. I've never been abused or even in a schoolyard fight, but that thought cracked through my mind with dead certainty. He wants to hit me. But from behind us, a voice called out a goodbye to Tim. The moment and all the tightness with it vanished, like Tim on a first date. His face smoothed. "Sure," was all he said, and he released his keys into my hand. Well, the ride back was strange. Tim was pushing, hard, for a verbal confirmation that we'd be hooking up when we arrived back at mine. I tried to be polite, but exasperated by the continual pushiness, I finally snapped. My throat was sore from a pack of cigarettes, and dry because my presence was so clearly unwanted at that party that I was too unnerved to even ask for a drink from the hose. And while Tim had had no issue ensuring he'd gotten drinks, clearly, he'd also just as clearly not given a single bother about bringing his date one. Yet here he was, acting like he'd purchased or earned the right to paw at me. At another slurred attempt to lock me down into committing to sleep with him, I let my voice lose all inflection and flatly told him, no. He tried to rebound, to playfully argue. and I repeated, "No. I'm driving you someplace you can crash and sleep it off." There was more babbling, more arguing, but I kept silent, and eventually he stopped trying, stared out the window instead. As angry as I was, we were going 60 miles per hour. I was glad that he'd finally calmed down. Back at my house and on solid footing, I waited for him to stumble around the side of his SUV to me, and then I put a hand out, keeping my arm fully extended to ward him from getting too close. I told him, "Here's what's going to happen. I am sleeping in my bed, alone. You can take the couch to sleep it off. You don't have to sleep, but you aren't getting your keys back until you sober up." He began to argue, acting confused and playful all over again, but at this point I was beyond trying to spare his feelings. I just stared back at him until he threw up his hands with a pissy, "Whatever." We made our way up the steps to the house I rented with a couple of friends, feeling a lot of relief that at least one of them was likely home. Inside, I pointed out the couch he could sleep on. The house was a split level, and I figured the lower level would provide enough separation from my room on the upper level. My gut was telling me, even as I did him a favor and gave him a place to sleep for the night, that I still needed to get distance. I headed upstairs, and I went to my bathroom. I must have been in there for a good 10 to 15 minutes, brushing my teeth, gargling to attack the soreness I felt blooming in my throat, just wasting time, cooling down. However, when I opened the bathroom door to wander back down the hall to my room, there stood Tim. I jumped back. My heart rate was going crazy at the shock of someone just standing outside the door with no warning. I had no idea how long he'd been standing there, silently waiting outside the door. It gave me a start. He was looking at me in an odd, intense way. The roomy, drunk film over his eyes made them look dull, like a sleepwalker, but his face kept twitching. I started cautiously by saying, "Tim, what are you doing?" He looked at me a beat longer, then looked down the hall. He wasn't giving off the hurt you vibe, so I chanced to guess. "Do you need to use the bathroom?" I mean, I had shown him the bathroom downstairs, but it was late and he was drunk. Maybe he forgot. He looked back at me and then nodded. I stepped aside to let him past me into the bathroom I'd just used. He stepped in and closed the door. I turned and took the short 2 or 3 steps to my bedroom. It shared a wall with the bathroom. I quickly closed and locked the bedroom door, and only then changed into the largest and most unflattering PJs I owned. I switched off the light, settled into bed, and had just started to doze when I heard a voice. Tim's voice. Tim's voice was coming through the wall. I could just make out the low rumble of him talking. But to whom? Was he talking on the phone this late? His voice remained too low to make out any words, just this low, buzzy sound coming from the bathroom. I waited. I was unable to allow myself to go to sleep until I'd known he'd gone back downstairs. But he didn't go back downstairs. When the bathroom door swung open, I heard his footsteps come out. They started down the hall towards the other bedroom, and then they paused. Quiet. Still. Oh God, was he standing outside my roommate's door, the same way he had my bathroom? But no. He took a couple of steps, and then I heard his footsteps come back my way, past the bathroom, to my door. With my heart creeping into my throat, I heard him clear his throat right outside my door. Slowly, I palmed my phone from its place on the nightstand. Without knocking, my door clicked. He was trying to open it. The knob rattled. The lock held through his repeated attempts. He wasn't knocking or speaking, calling out to me to come open it, and that put a cold drip of fear all through my blood. What was he doing? Why was he trying to get into my bedroom without my awareness? From somewhere else in the house, it sounded like downstairs, I heard a tinny ringtone, one I knew wasn't either of my roommates. Tim's phone then, downstairs. Well, but who had he been talking to in the bathroom then? But at this sound, I heard him retreat, and with an exhale I realized I'd been holding my breath. The sound of him creaking back down the stairs came moments later. I closed my eyes. I must have had one of those immediate slips into unconsciousness. At a sudden knock on my bedroom door, I jumped. I still had my phone in my hand, and I saw that a couple of hours had passed. Was he still up? Had he been up this whole time? I called out at the next knock. Tim? Hello? There was a pause. Then I heard him respond. Yeah. Hey, something's happened. Can you talk? Well, he sounded clearer, not near as badly as he was slurring before. I pulled myself out of bed, phone still in hand. I stood on the other side of the door. What's the matter? Silence. Tim? I asked again. This time, much closer to the door. I heard dismay in his voice as he repeated himself. Something had happened, and he asked if we could talk face to face. This probably sounds dumb, but I was so tired. I put my hand on the doorknob and I tested it. I figured if I kept a hand on the knob, I could slam it back shut in his face and twist the lock before he could get through. And besides, his voice sounded genuinely dismayed. What had happened? With that in mind, I opened the door. I made no move to stand aside or let him in, using my body to block the space between him and my room. As before, Tim was again standing right outside the door in the hallway. He looked at me. He shot me a sad and serious face, and then looked back down the hall. Something's happened, he said. It was so low and serious that my initial guess that he'd made a mess on my couch or in my bathroom, well, it evaporated. What? I asked. I stepped fully into the doorframe. He shifted backwards a step, looking a bit at a loss, confirming what I had thought, that he'd expected me to let him into my room. But instead, he started pacing back and forth, stopping to clench his fists and look intensely at me, at the floor, then back down the hallway. At the party, one of my friends got stabbed. I was stunned. Wait, what? I thought back to the crowded backyard. Someone stabbed someone at the birthday party? Yeah, no, not that party. The after party. He switched again from pacing to pause. He clenched his jaw. Then he turned his back fully to me, and in a low voice intoned, I should have been there. If I'd been there, Sean would be okay. My heart dropped. Sean, the boy I'd just met, I'd spent time talking to. He'd been attacked? How? Prescott was a college town, but a small one, and the rowdiest I'd ever seen anyone get there was drunk and yelling, maybe the occasional fist fight. But a stabbing? Tim paced again, talking, rambling, telling me that Sean had been outside a bar and some bum had just randomly stabbed him, and if Tim had been there, he'd have stopped it. But the more he talked, the more something seemed off. Even half asleep and half climbing the walls with nerves, it occurred to me that the after party he'd told me about was supposed to be at someone's house. Why would Sean have been at a bar? Why would he have been alone? Even as exhausted as I was, something just didn't feel right. Tim's next actions only made my suspicions grow. He stopped in front of me, flexed out his shoulders and, for lack of a better word, posed, jaw flexed, fists clenched, body and head turned like a superhero pose in a movie. I have to go. I have to do something, he intoned. It was all so dramatic, all auspices of him running off to be some avenging hero, and not at all about a friend of his, a new friend of mine, being hurt. Sean. I was already thinking of the phone in my hand, the phone that now had Sean's number. Still holding his pose, only Tim's eyes moved as he looked back from the middle distance to me. He told me I didn't have to worry about him, and this had really sobered him up. He had to leave, and he had to go find the guys who did this, so I just needed to give him his keys. I butted in. Guys? You said it was a bum. Tim's eyes shot back down the hall. Oops. That clinched it for me. I still had my phone in my hand, and as I brought it up, Tim's back to me as he began dramatically pacing again. I unlocked the phone and hit star 69 to ring the last person who'd called me. Then I put it on speaker. It rang twice, and then it picked up. A sleepy-sounding hello came loudly over the phone. It was Sean. Sean, who was very much not stabbed, but very confused as to why I would be calling him so late. Tim froze at the sound of Sean's voice. He whirled about, eyes wide. His intense posture was replaced with the most obvious I-got-caught face that I'd ever seen on an adult. He took a step towards me, his hand coming up to my phone, but I stepped backwards, back to where the door was between my body and his. I began asking Sean if he was okay, how I'd heard about a fight downtown. Sean said, "What? Nah, no one went downtown. A couple of kids had an after party, but that was in the student housing. But what fight? Are you okay?" I told him I was fine, and that we'd talk later now that I knew he was okay. I looked Tim dead in the eye the entire time. He was bigger than me, and he'd scared me a couple of times that night, but there's something to be said for the feminine rage. When I looked at Tim, I was enraged. When I said bye and hung up the phone, Tim was still standing there, silent. And then he started, saying he didn't know I knew Sean. And in fact, he added snottily, that he thought I said I didn't know anyone at that party. Without responding to Tim, I clicked open the ride-sharing app and ordered him a car. Tim was still talking as I walked past him, down the stairs, and sat in the main living room to face the front door. Tim kept pacing, trying to talk to me, needle me, tone going from accusatory that I had known someone at the party, to remorseful for getting what he'd heard wrong and worrying me. But I didn't respond. What could I even say at this point? When the rideshare showed up outside, I got up and walked Tim out. At this point, he'd switched to a sweet tone. He was thanking me for the offer, but insisted I'd just give him his keys and he'd drive home himself, bringing up what an inconvenience it would be to have to return and get his car later. Instead, I handed the keys to the driver to return to his drunken charge upon arrival at Tim's place. Then I turned on heel, just in time to see and duck, because Tim's closed fist was coming at me in an overhead swing. I jumped back, feeling all the fear I'd pushed down the whole night flood back. Tim had followed close behind me, and when my back was turned, he tried to hit me, club me over the head with a hammer fist. He wants to hit me. The driver got out of his car in a flash. He was a bit older, but a lot taller and heavier than Tim. He was ranting already about having seen what he tried to do. Tim immediately was all apologies, rambling that he'd been trying to playfully get his keys back. He'd been reaching for them. What, did I think he was the kind of person to hit a girl? I thought back to earlier in the night. Yeah, Tim, I do. The driver looked at me and didn't have to say another word. I was already calling 911. I didn't get to go back to bed that night. Tim stuck around, alternating between fits of yelling at us and slouching into a heap on the curb, his slurring fading in and out with his protests. 2 cop cars showed up. Both driver and I gave our statements, that Tim had tried to assault someone, a crime, to get his keys back so he could drive drunk, do another crime. It didn't bode well for him. I tried not to look at him as they put him in the back of the patrol car, but I felt the hatred in his stare, even as I walked back into my house and secured every lock between the front door and my bedroom. Later that morning, I called Sean again. He sounded like he'd been up a while too. He filled me in on the rest of the story. most of which was what I'd guessed. Tim had brought me along as he'd made the rounds in his friend group, and it was unlikely he'd have any luck scoring, as his reputation was well known. I was to be a sure thing, and somehow he hadn't put together that ditching me at the party and getting fall-down drunk would make me unlikely to sleep with him. When I told him in no uncertain terms it wasn't happening, he wanted to instead get to the after-party to try his luck there. But how to convince me to return his keys when he was clearly too drunk to drive? A sober person might have figured out the way that I did, even as sleep-deprived as I was: call a cab. But Tim wasn't the kind of person who could think in such a straightforward way. His idea was instead lie that a friend I wouldn't know, and thus couldn't confirm, got brutally attacked. Then act heroic and insist on having to go. It was a matter of life and death after all, and that would ensure he got his keys back. And bonus, the girl, me, would think of him as some Billy badass, going out to confront the evil attacker who'd hurt his friend. Sean had, for the record, called Tim himself. He'd meant to ream him out over it on the phone, but he hadn't been able to get through to him. So I had the honor of filling in why Tim wasn't answering his phone. What surprised me was Sean's lack of surprise at Tim's arrest. He did ask a few times if I was okay. He said aloud he was glad the driver had stuck around and not just driven off, and his parting shot was, "Well, it sucks Tim got arrested and all, but hell, maybe he needs this to figure things out." I could hear him shrug over the line, and I found that, when I hung up the phone, that a shrug, stuff happens, in the rise of a shoulder, was about as much as I'd ever understand about that night. And that's story 7. Show of hands. Who thought that the tragedy that he was going to tell her about was absolutely that he'd made a mess on the couch? It's happened. But I don't know if that would be better or worse. I suppose it depends on your point of view and your upholstery. If you have a story you'd like to share, social media is of course in the description as always. Liking, commenting, and subscribing is all genuinely appreciated, but never required. I'm just so happy you tuned in today. So until next Tuesday, stay strange, stay safe, and take care, strangers.